December 20th, 1943. Over the skies of Bremen, Germany, the U.S. 8th Air Force pushed hundreds of B-17 bombers into another daylight mission, one that had already cost them heavily in the weeks before. Among the formation was a brand new crew flying its very first combat mission, a B-17 called Olde Pub, commanded by a 21-year-old pilot, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown. Then the flak opened fire. A shell detonated directly in front of the cockpit. The nose glass shattered. Freezing air flooded the aircraft at nearly 30,000 feet. One engine failed. Others faltered. The oxygen system ruptured. The formation moved on. The bomber was left behind. A torn-open B-17, flying alone, deep inside German airspace. On radar screens, it appeared as an isolated contact. Slow, damaged, exposed. From a nearby airfield, a German fighter pilot took off. One squeeze of the trigger would be enough. But as he closed the distance, he saw something that forced the war to pause, just for a few seconds. By December 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a new phase. This was no longer a period of experimentation or probing attacks. It had become a campaign of deliberate attrition. The United States 8th Air Force flew in daylight, deep, directly into the industrial core of Nazi Germany. The targets were no longer symbolic. They were mathematical: factories, assembly lines, fuel depots, rail junctions. Each coordinate was selected to fracture Germany's ability to sustain war. The cost was already known. In the weeks leading up to mid-December, the 8th Air Force had lost hundreds of bombers. On some days, loss rates exceeded 10%. For a B-17 crew, the numbers were unforgiving. 25 missions meant survival was unlikely. Air crews gave this period a name: Black Week. American daylight bombing doctrine rested on a single assumption: tight formations plus overlapping defensive fire would protect the bomber force. A B-17 was not fast, it was not maneuverable, it was visible from miles away. But inside a combat box, each aircraft became part of a flying structure of steel, with dozens of .50 caliber machine guns covering every approach. The weakness was simple: break the formation, and the doctrine collapsed instantly. The Germans understood this better than anyone. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, the primary objective lay near Bremen. Bremen was not an ordinary city. It was a major production center for German fighter aircraft, including components for the Focke-Wulf 190. It was protected by dense anti-aircraft belts, early warning radar, and multiple fighter bases positioned for rapid interception. Many flak batteries around Bremen were manned by Luftwaffe officer candidate trainees, elite gunners trained for precision, not suppression. They were not firing to scare bombers away. They were firing to destroy them. Within a bomber formation, not every position carried equal risk. The outer edges, where defensive fire overlapped poorly, were the most exposed. American crews had a name for these slots: Purple Heart Corner. Unofficially, new crews were often placed there. That morning, the newest crew in the group took one of those positions. Their aircraft was a B-17 named Olde Pub. At the controls sat Charlie Brown, age 21. It was his first combat mission. Before the bomber could release its payload, German flak found it. A shell exploded directly in front of the cockpit. The plexiglass nose shattered. Air at nearly minus 60 degrees Celsius tore into the aircraft at over 100 miles per hour. Within minutes, one engine failed completely. Another destabilized. Oxygen lines ruptured. Lubricants began to freeze inside the guns. The bomber slowed. The formation did not. No aircraft turned back. Not from indifference, but because formations were not permitted to break. On German radar, the isolated bomber stood out immediately. A B-17, slow, damaged, alone. For Luftwaffe fighter pilots, this was a textbook target. Messerschmitt Bf 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S attacked in waves. They did not rush. They targeted the tail, the gun positions, the control surfaces. This method had been refined over thousands of interceptions. After more than 10 minutes, Olde Pub was barely controllable. Inside the aircraft, one crewman was dead. Several were seriously wounded. Oxygen was nearly gone. At altitude, the human brain shuts down quietly. Vision narrows, muscles weaken, Consciousness fades. Charlie Brown lost awareness. The bomber entered an uncontrolled dive. Only when it dropped into denser air did oxygen return enough to revive him. He pulled back on the controls. The wings held. Directly beneath the bomber's path lay a German fighter airfield. On the ground, a pilot had just landed after scoring 2 victories that morning. One more bomber would bring him within reach of Germany's Knight's Cross. His name was Franz Stigler. He looked up. What he saw was not a formation. It was a single bomber, flying far too low, far too slow, its structure visibly torn apart. For Stigler, this was not an air battle. It was a sentence waiting to be carried out. The B-17 was flying lower than any bomber should have been that morning. It no longer held operational altitude. It was no longer inside a formation. It no longer belonged to Doctrine. Over northern Germany, that combination meant one thing. This aircraft was supposed to be destroyed. When Franz Stigler advanced the throttle and took off, he was not climbing to reflect. He was responding by instinct. A lone B-17 was opportunity. A damaged B-17, slow and low, was certainty. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe was under strain. Experienced fighter pilots were no longer common. Men like Stigler were strategic assets. He had already shot down 2 American bombers that morning. One more would move him closer to Germany's highest decoration. As he closed in from behind, something was immediately wrong. There was no defensive fire, no tail gun, no tracer rounds, no evasive movement. The bomber did not react. At close range, aircraft stopped being symbols. They are no longer targets. They are no longer enemy machines. They are structures full of people. The bomber's tail was gone. Sections of fuselage were missing. The interior was visible through torn aluminum. Stigler could see. A gunner motionless at his station. Blood frozen onto metal surfaces. Surviving crew members struggling to keep the aircraft airborne. No one was fighting. They were waiting. Fighter training once carried an unspoken rule. Not law, not treaty, but professional inheritance from the First World War. Do not kill a defenseless opponent. By 1943, that rule no longer appeared in manuals. Total war did not encourage hesitation, yet it had not vanished completely. To fire on this bomber would not be combat, it would be termination. From the cockpit, Charlie Brown saw the German fighter slide into position. He did not think about surrender. He did not consider escape. He assumed these were his final seconds. There was no order to bail out. There was no oxygen left. No one was fully conscious. If the German fired, everyone would die. Brown kept his hands on the controls. He did not look away. Stigler moved alongside the bomber. He gestured. He pointed downward. He motioned to change direction. There was no shared radio frequency, no shared language. Every movement could be interpreted as preparation for a kill. Brown did not understand. The bomber continued west. Stigler realized the situation clearly. The B-17 could not land safely in Germany. If it landed, the crew would become prisoners. Several would likely die from wounds. Questions would follow about why the aircraft was not destroyed. If he fired, the mission would be complete. The paperwork would be clean, and the outcome would be final. Stigler chose an option that did not exist in Luftwaffe procedure. He would escort the enemy aircraft out of German airspace. Under German military law, allowing an enemy aircraft to escape, assisting its survival, failing to fire when ordered, could all be interpreted as treason. The penalty was execution. Stigler knew this. He closed the distance further. The German fighter moved into close position off the bomber's left wing. Only meters separated them. From the ground, a German fighter, a large bomber, flying together. The Luftwaffe had previously operated captured B-17S ground crews were trained to recognize Escort silhouettes. Stigler used his aircraft as a living shield. Radar tracked 2 aircraft moving together. No alarm sounded. No guns fired. They approached the coast. Ahead lay the North Sea, 250 miles of freezing water. If the bomber failed over the sea, survival time would be measured in minutes. But at least it was no longer under German guns. Stigler held position for several seconds more. He looked into the American cockpit. Brown looked back. No words and no further signals. Stigler raised his hand in salute. Not ceremonial, not formal. Then he banked left and turned back. If questioned later, he would have to explain why one bomber was missing from his claims. Stigler did not report the incident. No notation, no explanation. He understood that silence was necessary to remain alive. On the other side, when the bomber reached England, the American crew received similar instructions. The story was classified, not out of respect for mercy, but out of fear that such stories weaken the logic of war. No campaign changed because of this decision. No map was redrawn. No order was amended. The war continued unchanged. But for the 9 men aboard that bomber, everything had already turned. When the German fighter turned away, there was no celebration inside the bomber. No relief, no certainty. The B-17 was still airborne, and that was still a problem. From a tactical perspective, the engagement was over. No fighters pursued them. No flak followed. Inside Olde Pub, the war had not ended. It had changed shape. A fully functional B-17 was a carefully balanced system. 4 engines, hydraulics, electrical power, oxygen supply, heating, structural integrity. Olde Pub was no longer a system. It was a collection of parts that had not yet separated. Engine 2 was dead. Engine 3 produced half power. Engine 4 surged unpredictably. Only Engine 1 remained reliable. Hydraulics were gone. Electrical power flickered. The radio was silent. The bomber flew on inertia, skill, and restraint. Lower altitude brought thicker air and more oxygen. It also carried consequences. The B-17 was designed to fly high. At low altitude, it burned fuel faster, lost aerodynamic efficiency, became vulnerable. Charlie Brown had to hold speed at the edge of failure. Too slow meant stall. Too fast meant structural overload. There were no formulas left, only feedback through the controls. Inside the aircraft, 1 man was dead. 6 were wounded. Morphine was unusable. The syringes had frozen solid. Temperatures remained below freezing. Air poured through torn aluminum. Blood hardened on metal surfaces. No one screamed. Breathing became the only sound. Hypoxia did not strike dramatically. It dimmed awareness. Vision narrowed. Limbs lost sensation. Thought slowed. Sleep felt close. Falling asleep meant death. Pilots fought consciousness with will alone. In theory, crews supported each other. In reality, those conscious stayed conscious. The wounded endured. Nothing more was possible. There were no medical reserves, no heat, no specialists. War reduced people to function. Ahead lay gray water without landmarks. December conditions. Near freezing temperatures. Survival time after ditching measured in minutes. There were no rescue aircraft on standby. No ships tracking their position. If the bomber went down, it would disappear. Distance, roughly 250 miles. Airspeed, around 140 miles per hour. Time aloft, nearly 2 hours. 2 hours on, 1.5 engines. A compromised airframe. Unstable power, no radio. Brown stopped watching the clock. He watched oil temperature, pressure gauges, engine tone. Any deviation could end everything. One gunner lost sensation in his legs. Heating wires in his suit had shorted. Numbness meant tissue death. Another crewman had shrapnel in his eye. Vision blurred. No one cried. The body conserved energy by suppressing emotion. The tail gunner's body stayed where it had fallen. There was no space and no time. In aerial war, the dead often remained in place. There were no rights, no pauses. After nearly 2 hours, the horizon shifted. Water gray became land gray. No one spoke. Crews had seen land before and still fallen short. Brown maintained focus, low, slow, controlled. Hydraulics were gone. Landing gear might fail to deploy. Lock partially, collapse. Flaps responded unevenly. Brown selected the nearest airfield. He did not plan a safe landing. He planned a controlled impact. The gear extended unevenly. The bomber touched down. Metal scraped concrete. Sparks flared. The aircraft skidded, then stopped. There was no explosion. Brown did not release the controls immediately. His body shook, not from cold, from release. 8 men exited the aircraft alive. 1 was carried out. The bomber would never fly again. For this crew, hell was not the attack. Hell was the silence that followed. 2 hours where no one fired, No one spoke. Survival depended entirely on whether machinery could endure a little longer. When the Olde Pub came to rest on the runway, the war did not stop with it. There was no applause, no ceremony, no recognition, only the next order. In the debriefing room, Charlie Brown reported everything. The German fighter flying alongside, no shots fired. An escort across the coast. The intelligence officers did not react with surprise. They issued an order. The incident was not to be discussed, not written down, not mentioned, even among crews. The reasoning was not moral. It was operational. Stories like this blurred enemy boundaries. They weakened clarity. They complicated the logic required to continue killing. War demanded simplicity, and simplicity required silence. In Germany, Franz Stigler also filed no unusual report. No bomber was recorded as having escaped. There was nothing to explain. Stigler understood the environment he was operating in. By late 1943, scrutiny was constant. Tolerance was gone. Deviation meant suspicion. In the Luftwaffe, survival depended on compliance. Silence was not a moral stance. It was a condition for staying alive. The air war intensified. The 8th Air Force continued flying. The Luftwaffe continued intercepting. Nothing changed strategically because of that day. Brown completed his tour and returned home. Stigler kept flying as Germany's fighter force collapsed around him. Two lives moved forward on separate trajectories. Neither man knew whether the other had survived. After 1945, the world reorganized. But for veterans, war rarely ended with a treaty. It remained internal. Brown built a civilian life, family, work, routine. Stigler left a destroyed Germany. He emigrated to Canada. He rebuilt from nothing. Both carry the same unresolved question. Did it really happen? Time did not erase the memory. It buried it. For Brown, the image of the German fighter never faded, not because it frightened him, because it contradicted everything war was supposed to be. For Stigler, the moment he did not fire became fixed in his life. Not as pride, as an anomaly with no place to exist. Decades later, as veterans age, Brown began to search. Not for recognition, not for a story, for confirmation. He wrote letters, contacted veterans groups, published notices in aviation newsletters. For years, nothing came back. Then one letter arrived. It contained only a few words. I was the one. When Brown and Stigler met, there were no speeches, no prepared statements. Two elderly men stood facing each other, not as enemies, not as heroes, as the only two people who could verify a shared memory. They spoke quietly, compared details. Everything matched. The altitude, the damage, the salute. There was no doubt. The story slowly entered historical record. Not as legend, as a verified case. Flight paths, radar logs, unit records, all confirmed the same conclusion. A bomber had escaped under circumstances that defied doctrine. No propaganda followed, only documentation. The incident does not argue that war was humane. It does not erase responsibility. It does not soften history. It demonstrates something narrower. That even in total war, there remained limited space for individual choice. That space was dangerous, rare, and usually invisible. In statistical terms, 9 lives survived. The war continued unchanged. In historical terms, 1 documented instance of discretionary restraint, a rare data point in aerial combat ethics. The act did not alter World War II. It altered how we understand individuals within it. Brown and Stigler stayed in contact until the end of their lives. They did not seek attention. They did not shape the narrative. When asked, Stigler spoke briefly. He did not describe heroism. He described inevitability, an action he could not take. Brown described obligation, not obligation to survival, obligation to truth. Both men died in the same year. There was no shared monument, no joint ceremony. Only the story remained. It belonged to neither side. It existed because it happened. For historians, the incident does not contradict the brutality of war. It confirms it. Within systems designed for destruction, humans remained the final decision makers, and occasionally they paused.